more resources, visit rym.org.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.
The Local Youth Worker is a daily podcast that's centered on 5 questions each week. Ranging from the practical to the professional, we're looking for answers to the questions you're asking. Whether you're in full-time, part-time, or even volunteer youth ministry, this podcast is for you.
Hey everybody, we're back talking to John Stone. We've covered a lot of ground, a lot of good advice about ministry, and today in light of that, and some of this might be redundant, John, it might go back over some of what you've said, but just again, since you've been in ministry for decades, what are the most common mistakes that you see people tend to make in ministry? Just again, from your decades of being in ministry and being around campus ministers specifically, but I know a lot of this would apply to youth ministry and other areas of ministry. What are those common mistakes you see people make?
I think one that would jump to mind for me would be expecting people to change and to change too much or too quickly. So certainly the gospel, especially as the Spirit works in us and sanctifies us, we're changed. We take off the old and we put on the new. But I think that you see a general frustration often in ministers, maybe more especially younger ministers, in kind of expecting that change to be sudden and dramatic, and even sometimes quantifiable. And again, sometimes, I had a friend who was a massive druggie and was born again when he heard a street preacher, and he never touched drugs again. And that it's really real, but that story is not typical of how God works. And God thinks about things over decades and centuries and not over 10 minutes. So I think, I don't know how that mistake always manifests itself, but you just see some anger, I think, in ministers at their people because they're not, quote, changing. And I think certainly there's some legitimacy in that. We all have folks in our lives who we think, man, nothing has changed. But again, as we speak to youth pastors and younger ministers, just this desire to see kids change and change pretty rapidly can be really problematic, I think, for your own soul and for your own tone. It just creates a tone in your ministry, a pressure from you that is actually antithetical to letting people change, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think you go ahead, John.
Sorry, I'm jumping in on you. I think that goes back of just what we were saying earlier, of just talking about humility, and specifically with those who are young in ministry, just praying for that, asking for that, because again, years on this earth have a way of bringing about humility. The suffering in the world and all of it does, humble someone after, again, just years on this earth. So the lack of that can, just want us to kind of encourage students and not the most encouraging tone, to just change and to get better and to stop doing this or whatever. So maybe that kind of goes along with what you're saying.
Yeah. I think a cousin to that is, and man, I feel this, and is a bad expectation about participation. So one of the things that has been true for me, John, and this is not, pardon me, is it's like this could come off as the humble brag, but when I tell the real story, it can't be a humble brag because it's bad. If I look back at my core group members, and I had some great core group members and a lot are walking with Christ, but gosh, a good number of my core group members, these are my leadership team in REF, I'm not sure in Christ anymore, not walking with Christ, have had pretty tough stories and gone through some pretty tough times, much of their own making. They're in some ways reaping what they sowed. And I just think, man, I really failed them. And these were my highest participators. They came to REF. They loved it. But just recently, I was in a restaurant in Johnson City, Tennessee, and a gentleman stops and says, "Hey, John, my name is," and John, I don't remember his name. I'd say it right here. And you don't remember her, but this is my wife, so-and-so, and we have 3 kids. And we used to sneak into the back of your REF large group, and we became Christians back there. We never met you. We never came to any REF events. We never were in a small group Bible, so we just heard you preach. And we're now in a church, and our kids are in church because you had that ministry. And if I had marked my ministry by their participation, like they're this sort of trophy of grace where God had these pagans sit in the back of my room. I don't ever remember seeing him. He told me I'd never met him until that night in the restaurant. And yet, it's just hard to know what God is doing. Mm-hmm. And I know in the church, especially when people have young children, you're fortunate if you can get them to half of your Sundays between travel baseball, legitimate vacations, fatigue, illness, school events. And I think that, again, just sort of a theme here, John, I didn't mean just have a merge, but like you just see some angry ministers because they don't have the right participation. But I think God's at work, not us and not our programs. And especially, in the youth ministry business, you're going to have some kids who are literally barely hanging on to the fringe. And 15 years from now, they're the people who God will have really used just your angry faithfulness at their non-participation to help them end up in the kingdom. And, encouraging people to participate, encouraging people to be there is really legitimate. But you just can feel younger ministers not understanding why the average congregant, whether that is the youth or is only there half the time. And again, that's sort of that point where like you're professionally going to be there and understanding them. But that participation, it can just be pretty unrealistic. And again, remember this, you're going to be stunned 15 years from now by who actually heard and who didn't hear. And you're going to be stunned. And the third thing go ahead.
No, I was just going to say some good perspective there for sure. And so first is being frustrated at people's lack of change, lack of growth, and kind of like you said, a cousin to that, their lack of participation, and the common thread there, kind of some anger and frustration.
Yes.
And then leading into the third, you were saying?
Well, John, we need to you and I need to start a podcast just called The Angry Minister and just interview ministers and say, tell us what you really think. I think that would be popular. I think the third thing you got to be careful about in ministry is needing, like we're made to work, so our work is important, and enjoying it and loving it are important. But needing it to be your identity is something you need to be careful about. You've got to learn to really tap into Christ as your means of being justified, and not how big your youth group is, not how many people went to your fall retreat, not how many parents loved you. And it's okay to measure those things. It's okay to step into why didn't I have people go to the fall conference? It's great, but great ministers learn to be secure in Christ while loving the sheep deeply and hurting when they're not there and being sad when they don't participate and going after the lost sheep. But they also learn that their identity is in Christ and not in those folks, because you're disappointing them and they're going to be disappointed in you, and you're going to be disappointed in them. And if you need that for your identity, we'll entitle it burnout, but it's something more fundamental. You're going to end up bitter and angry and wondering if the gospel's true. And in some ways, it's the hardest. It's very hard for a minister to believe in the justifying work of Christ when what you do is stand in front of a group of people that the Bible itself is asking you to make bigger through conversions and growth. And so it's a very complex thing. So needing your work it's something you need to think about. And I think we're going to do a day on this, or no, this is why, I made a passing reference to it. Like, when I say a lot, and if you know me at all, I say a lot to people, you need to be in counseling. What I mean by that is you need somebody in your life that's not your wife, who you professionally tell everything to, and who you let dissect your heart a little bit. You cannot navigate this water by yourself. You need to be able to sit down and process your own story well with somebody. And a lot of that will be related to, why do I need my group to succeed? Why do I need it to be bigger? Why am I getting so much life from this? Those are great questions, but you need to be processing them.
Yeah, and I think that does serve as a good segue. Tomorrow we are going to talk about counseling specifically, but this issue of identity is something every single human being, struggles with. And we've said on this podcast before, we all wake up with an identity crisis each and every day. We're looking for all these other things to give us our identity, whether it's our job or our marriage or parenting or whatever. And so, yeah, it's very complex. And so we are, as those specifically in youth ministry, going to be longing to get our identity from that and sense of worth from that. So like you said, asking some of those heart questions of yourself, that's probably one good practical place to start, and reminding yourself of the gospel. But as you're suggesting, counseling. So that's something we'll discuss more tomorrow. Anything to add to that before we close out?
I think that's it on this topic.
All right. Thanks, Sean.